Well, here we are in the seediest part of planet Earth, Soho, London. This used to be the Raymond Review Bar back in the day, and I'm with Pattie Boyd. Pattie, we're going to have a long talk about your wonderful life,
yes,
which is now reflected in a best-selling book, which we have behind us here, wonderful today. We'll talk about your marriages to George Harrison and Eric Clapton. We'll talk about the 60s in a little while, but let's go back to your childhood. That was in Kenya?
Yes.
And, well, tell us about it. Tell us about your childhood, your upbringing.
As a family, we went out there when I was about 3 years old and stayed with my grandparents. And they lived in a very lovely, large house with sort of manicured gardens that just went straight into wilderness. And
you were a moneyed family, weren't you? Your great-grandfather built bridges in India and all
yes,
this stuff, and you were quite wealthy, really. So
I suppose so, but as a child you don't realise that.
You had scullery maids and things like that running around.
Well, if you live in Africa,
yes,
you do automatically, I think, have staff.
Yes, unless you're an African.
Exactly, yes. And anyway, it was a lovely life. It was a glorious life.
You didn't really have a very happy life in terms of your mum and dad's relationship, did you, for example?
No, I didn't. They hardly ever spoke to each other. It was a very sort of, well, it was very non-communicative. I seem to remember us not really talking at meal times either. This was...
No telly, no talking at mealtimes. It must have been
telly.
Awful for the kids.
It was.
Your most famous dive into the pool of the 60s was that fantastic job you got on Hard Day's Night Movie. Before that, what happened? How did you decide what you were going to do with your career? Where were you living in London? What was life like in the 60s for you?
I shared a flat with about 8 girls, and it was complete madness. And I was working in a place called Elizabeth Arden. And
Elizabeth Arden gave you a hard time about your eyeliner, didn't she?
Yes, she did. She didn't like my makeup.
I hope she didn't undermine your confidence about your own
care.
beauty.
No, I didn't care.
Were you aware that you were a stunning girl? Did that ever hit you at that point?
No.
Were the boys all over you like flies?
Not really.
No?
No.
Then was it all Beatlemania in London at that point?
Not really.
No.
I mean, I was aware that they were a great band.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think there was Beatlemania. I mean, from my perspective, I was a model. I was really only interested in photographers and models and, work and what we were doing and the fun we were having. Mm-hmm. Music was part of our life.
So what kind of music were you listening to before you met the Beatles? Anything that was playing out of Radio Luxembourg or what?
Yes, definitely. Used to listen to Luxembourg every
yes,
evening.
Yes.
I loved the Everly Brothers and Elvis, obviously.
Yes.
And...
who you met later in life?
Yes, twice.
Fantastic. So you got the job on the movie. You must have been thinking, I'm not an actress. What am I doing this for?
I did.
Did you nearly turn it down?
Yeah, I know. I panicked because I thought they must believe that I'm an actress when I'm not, and I never had any desire to be.
So you turned up. Explain that day. I mean, it's captured in the movie. Explain the day. What happened?
I'd played the part of a schoolgirl, so I was dressed in school uniform, as were 2 other models. And we had to wait on the station, on the platform at Paddington Station, and then get on a certain train. And drew out of Paddington, and then somewhere in the suburbs it stopped. And there were only 4 little figures, lonely figures on the platform. And they hopped onto the train, instantly recognisable, came into our carriage and introduced themselves. Sweet.
John, Paul, George and Ringo.
Absolutely. Shook our hands.
Are you all right, lad?
And then they sort of flew out.
Wow.
And we were like, oh, God, this is so awful. Imagine meeting them in your school uniform. No, it didn't sound right. It didn't seem right.
And there you were, every girl's dream in the country, sitting next to a Beatle. The good-looking one.
Yes. I didn't realise he was every girl's dream, of course.
Had he become your dream by the end of the train journey?
I thought he was pretty tasty.
No thoughts of the millions he was going to make, because of course nobody knew. It was just the beginning of their career. They were not like multi-millionaires at that point. They were trying to become successful artists worldwide.
Yes.
It was the formative days of their career. So you were there right at the start. Well, how did the first date with George come along? If there was such a thing.
There was a first date. He did ask me out that afternoon after filming.
He did more than that.
Well, he asked me to marry him.
He did, didn't he? So he knew what he wanted to do in life right there and then. You didn't quite grasp it, did you?
No, I didn't. I thought he was joking.
Yeah, maybe he was at that point.
Maybe he was.
Yeah.
He must have been.
Yeah.
Yes. Nobody'd be that foolish. Anyway, he asked me out, and I said that I couldn't. I was going out with my boyfriend that night.
Was that true?
That was true. But I thought, well, maybe he's, doesn't know what to do tonight. He's on his own in London, maybe. So I said, why don't you come along too? And he didn't sort of like that answer. So, as luck would have it, 10 days later, we were called back for a little more filming. And this wasn't on the original schedule. So all could have been lost, you see.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went back to, this time, Twickenham Studios. And they'd filmed a little bit more and did some press shots of us girls, 4 of us, combing in behind each Beatle, doing their hair. So, of course, I went for George's hair.
Of course.
And he asked me how my boyfriend was, and I said, no, well, he had to go.
If it's not too intrusive a question, when you met George, were you a virgin?
No.
What was the first date like?
We went out for dinner, and Brian Epstein, his manager, came with us, which was rather nice, actually, because George and I are both very, very shy. And Brian was the sort of intermediary, and he took us to a really nice, very grown-up restaurant. See, George and I were only 20, 21,
Mm-hmm.
quite young.
Exactly.
And so Brian sort of took us out.
He was like George's dad, really, wasn't he?
Yeah. Or older brother.
Yes.
Yes.
And everything George did, Brian sorted out for him, approved of it, and helped him with. And you
As he did for the other, he did for all of them.
Yeah.
He was a sort of
So the first
a father
date,
figure,
the
really.
first date you had Brian with you.
Yes.
It was a meal somewhere, was it?
Yes.
How did the relationship develop thereafter?
Then we started to see a lot of each other. But during that time that we were seeing each other, which was probably 2 years before we got married, sometimes George was off on a tour or recording, or I was working, so we would see each other whenever we could.
You were pretty busy yourself, formulating your career. The Beatlemania thing happened. Nobody in those days, from what I can remember, I was a DJ on Radio Caroline in those days, and I seem to recall Brian didn't like the idea of John letting it be known that he was married, and the idea that any Beatle would announce he had a steady girlfriend was taboo. Did you live in that kind of framework of, existing in love but not being able to shout from the mountains?
I was aware of it on one occasion when there was a film premiere, and Brian wouldn't let me go with George.
What about Paul and Jane Asher? Was that going on at that time as well?
Yes, it was.
Mick and Marianne and all that.
Yes.
And they were your friends, and that was
Yes.
that was the clique in those days.
Yes.
So he proposed. How did Brian say yes? I mean, he must have had to give his permission, wouldn't he?
Mainly for one reason, which I'll tell you. George and I were in London one evening, early evening, and he said he just had to go and see Brian. So he stopped the car, went into Brian's house to say that we wanted to get married. And he had to ask Brian because Brian was the only person that knew their recording dates and when they were going on tour.
Oh, really? So it wasn't asking permission, it was just seeing whether it would work?
Yes, yeah.
And he left you in the car?
Yes.
In case there was some sparks in the house?
I don't think so. No, I was very fond of Brian.
Were you?
Yes. Yeah.
So he came out,
Yes.
opened the car door,
Yes.
sat down next to you,
Gave me a big kiss.
And said,
we're going to get married. Brian said January would be the best time so that we could go for a honeymoon afterwards.
Fantastic.
And then they would go away.
Was it a difficult thing to plan with all the fans milling around?
Yes, so that's why it was kept very quiet. So we didn't really tell anyone, only our very close friends. It was a very small wedding. It was just a family and a few friends, that's all.
Who was the best man, for example?
Paul.
Was he?
Yes.
And your bridesmaids?
No, I didn't have bridesmaids.
Didn't have bridesmaids?
No, it wasn't a church wedding.
No. It was in
It was a registry office.
In Esher.
No, in Epsom.
At Epsom. So then you went off on honeymoon. What was that like?
That was wonderful.
Where did you go?
We went to Barbados. It wasn't as busy as it is now. Not too many people were there. It was still rather sort of funky. There was probably about 2 wonderful hotels. And it was the most glorious beaches you can imagine. It was a fabulous time. The Queen and Prince Philip came by in an open-top
You must have
car.
thought they'd come to have tea with you.
No,
Oh, look, Philip, there's George and Pattie.
wave. No, so, yes, it was actually the maid said, oh, look, 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 your queen is down there. So we rushed out into the garden and there they were in the car.
How fantastic.
Because I think she was there for independence of Barbados.
Mm-hmm. There was a point, if I remember, where Bob Dylan introduced them to marijuana. Was that around about this time? Because they didn't smoke up until Dylan introduced it to them, and then it seemed to just explode around everybody.
When they went to America, they met Dylan.
Dylan, yeah.
And in New York, he introduced them to dope.
Yes.
And then when they came back,
Yes.
George, do you know what? I'm thinking about it. I think he must have just brought it back in his bag.
Well, nobody would search them in those days because nobody knew anything about it. The police didn't know what it was or anything, you know.
So, and then at this time, my girlfriend Mary B and I were living in a Muse house that George had got for us. And so when he came back from tour, he would be there as well. Anyway, he came back from America and rolled us a joint. We watched in fascination. And then he told us how to smoke. So we took a few tokes and then off we went.
And then began the hedonistic time in your book. I mean, partying everywhere. It just seemed like a wonderful, wonderful party that you lived at that time. Until the point where the meditation and the Maharishi and the Bangor incident, going down to Bangor, began. Tell us about that. Was that George? I seem to recall you had some influence in this respect of meditation.
Well, only in as much as while they were on tour, I think in Australia, I'd read a little advertisement. It was advertising teaching meditation. So I went along with a girlfriend, Mary-Lise, and we learnt how to meditate, and we were initiated, which means that we were given a mantra to say, a quiet mantra. And then when they came back from their tour, I explained the whole process to George. And quite soon after that, Maharishi came to London to give a lecture. And Paul must have heard about it, or heard about him. And it ended up, everybody went in the end. So we all attended the lecture. And Maharishi had never heard of the Beatles, and he was amazed at the amount of press, obviously at one of his lectures, more so than any other time.
Yeah.
So he realised that something was going on here.
Yes.
So he almost insisted that we all went up to Wales, Bangor in Wales.
He was actually an astute businessman, wasn't he? He knew what he was obtaining here.
Well, if it wasn't him, it was one of
People
his
behind him.
sidekicks.
But the thing about his teachings, if I remember rightly, it's a drug-free culture, it's a drug-free philosophy.
Alcohol-free.
Yeah. How did it sit with them all? I mean, the idea that if you go this way, the alcohol and everything else has got to be put on the shelf. Nobody thought about that?
No.
Were you, for example, drinking at night in Bangor, even though the teacher was saying don't?
No, we didn't think about it.
No.
If you're doing something, you don't think about what you have been doing previously. But we didn't.
Right.
It's like, oh, this is what we're doing now.
But then, devastating news, yes?
Then, the most dreadful news, it was like a huge black cloud hung over us, as when we heard that Brian Epstein had died. And it was just so shocking. Nobody could believe it.
How was the news imparted to you and the boys?
I think there was a phone call, one of the roadies, either Neil Aspinall or Mal Evans.
Did you call everyone together to tell them at the same time?
Yes.
Must have been absolutely devastating.
It was devastating.
Yeah.
There was silence. Nobody knew what to do.
Yes.
But what I felt was the fact that, we were actually quite lucky because at least we were all together, number one, and then also that we were with Maharishi, who was a great comfort because really and truly, I mean, the guys were really so shocked and upset and they just went white. I mean, I'd never seen such a reaction.
Well, you went to India next, didn't you?
Yes, went to India.
And Donovan went with you.
Donovan
Your
came.
sister Jenny.
And Jenny.
And he wrote Jennifer Juniper for her.
He did.
While George was writing something for you. I think everybody wants to know that moment he first sang it to you. It was in the kitchen, wasn't it?
No, he'd been playing it over and over.
Right.
And he didn't say it was for me. He
Right.
first of all played it on his guitar until he got it right, and then he went to the studio and recorded it there. And then when he played it to me, he said that he'd written it for me.
About you. It was all about you, inspired by you.
Yes.
Well, there's more to come in your life later on, but that must have been quite something, knowing that something was written about you and you inspired that song. Shame you weren't given any of the royalties.
Shame. I agree with you.
Because you were the subject matter. You should have been. So you were keeping busy cooking. I mean, you would never
Gardening.
dream. You would never dream of sending out for a pizza because cooking became your passion, didn't it? You loved cooking, shopping in Henley, coming back with real ingredients, and you'd stopped being a model. Was that an easy decision to make? Was it George who asked you to stop being a model, or did it just happen naturally?
No, he didn't want me to be a model.
He didn't want you to
No.
be a model. Okay.
Although the Beatles did come and see me when I was doing a fashion show for a designer called Ozzie Clark.
Then, life sailing along, and Eric Clapton arrived in your life.
Well, we'd actually known him for a very long time, for years, in fact, years. And he would quite often come and visit.
Now, tell us the story about the evening at the Old Calcutta. You were sat there with a friend.
Yes, I was there with Peter Brown, who looked after the Beatles. And Eric wanted to swap places with him. I think this is how it went. And then he said to me, "Are you going to Robert's party?" And I said, "Yes, yes." So off we all went with Peter. And sometime later, maybe 3 o'clock in the morning, George disappeared in the garden and I was talking to Eric. And to my total amazement, he said to George, "I'm in love with your wife." I thought, oh my gosh.
That must be the nightmare of nightmares for a husband to hear, that his friend is in love with his wife. How did George respond?
It was, I think he was quite, he was angry with Eric, very angry with Eric, and then decided to take it out on me. So he just said to me, was I coming home with him or going back with Eric? So I sort of stuck in the middle, and I said, "Oh, George, let me see, I'm coming back with you."
Your mind must have been abuzz with thoughts.
It was.
Were you aware that he was in love with you at that point, or was this like really a confirmation of something you'd suspected, or what?
I knew because he'd written me a little note, but I didn't realise it was from him.
Oh, right. Because he didn't sign it. Do you remember what the note said?
Not exactly, but he said at the end it was "Love E." Could mean anyone, but it basically it was.
You thought it was a fan letter?
I thought it was a fan letter. It was a most endearing letter, full of love and.
You were so
etc.
unaware it was Eric.
I
you
showed it
to
to
George and other people.
I showed it to George and said, "Look at this funny little letter." And it wasn't until that evening that when the phone rang and Eric asked me if I got his letter.
And then you
I
knew.
didn't know that was
Then you
from
knew.
him.
I just find it so amazing. You've got George doing his meditation, and you've got Eric pining for you. As we learn later, you know, he was an alcoholic. He had a lot of problems in that area. Did you recognise that in him then? Any problems?
Well, I thought he was drinking a little too much. But you see, in those days, it was taboo to say that anyone was an alcoholic. What I understood as an alcoholic is somebody who is homeless, and I'm sorry about this for homeless people, but an alcoholic equaled someone who lived on the street, basically, and couldn't get their lives together.
That was the view in those days.
That is what an alcoholic meant to us. But I would secretly think that he was an alcoholic. And as time went on, you know, and I tried and watered down his drinks and this, that, and the other. I mean, it just went on and on. I started seeking medical advice from doctors who knew a little bit about that area. Not many did in those days. Whenever Eric would go to his doctor, his normal GP, for a health check, I'd phone the doctor immediately and say, "Tell him he must stop drinking," or "Tell him to cut out his drinking." And then, of course, you know, he'd come back and he'd say, "Oh, the doctor says I'm fine, I'm well, and nothing wrong with me."
Yeah. Tell us how it happened. When the day came when you left George and the emotions you were going through? What was
Well,
that
it was
day
it was terribly difficult. It was terribly difficult to leave, and I thought that I would leave and go and stay with my sister in Los Angeles.
like? When did Eric win you over finally?
A few months later.
Yeah?
He was on tour in America. He went on tour and tracked me down to my sister's and phoned and asked me if I wanted to join him because he knew I'd never been on tour before.
Of all the songs that have been written about you, if it was Layla, which he wrote for you, or if it was something by George, I imagine one of those two would win the poll. Which one would be the one you would put at the top of your chart? Songs written about me, for me.
I don't know. It's very different. It's difficult because I like them for different reasons.
Yes.
Because they're different, obviously different people.
That's a bit like
And I have
asking which
different
was the
memories.
best man. They've both got their own
Yes.
goods and bads.
Yes.
Yeah. But Layla was pretty classic. Your sister had a problem with the track. Because she was living with Eric before you. Paula?
She was living with Eric, but so wasn't some. He had quite a few people living in his house.
Yes.
Again, he had a large house.
Yes.
And
But she was, in the literary sense, in the biblical sense, living with him, wasn't she? No?
Who knows?
Do you not know?
Sometimes she was and sometimes she wasn't.
Right.
It was all very loose.
But she left him when she found out Layla was written about her older sister.
Yes. She felt that she'd been
Devastated.
used. Yes. Yeah. Not very nice.
If you had to look back over your life and pick a 5-year period that was the one you cherish, which would it be?
I think probably the 5 years from when I met George,
Right.
because that was such a surprise and such an extreme right-hand turn in my life that I imagined would be a fairly sort of average and normal life.
And since you left Eric, has there been any other love in your life? Has your heart been moved by anyone?
Yes, I've had a very dear friend called Rod for quite a few years, and then we split up. But I mean, we see each other all the time, so I don't know if we've split up or not.
I often think that marriage leads to a good companionship if it's worked out for a long period of time. But reading your story, it strikes me that you don't really need one person because you've got so many people in your life. I've never known somebody with so many friends. You can go anywhere in the world and have a friend who'll put you up for the night.
Aren't I lucky?
You are. And do you feel that as you
Yes,
look
I
back
do.
on your life? Aren't I lucky?
Yes.
I think you were too, and I think you've been a beautiful, beautiful person. I enjoyed reading your book so much
Thank
and
you.
learning your side of the story, because you've been very quiet throughout your life. We haven't really read much about you.
No.
And you finally opened your heart. Pattie Boyd, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.